Hey everyone, this is part 2 of our discussion with Pete Shulman. It picks up right where we left off in part 1. Welcome back. Okay, I think a lot of people would agree, especially looking at data from years back, that a number of our test scores, they were stagnant, other countries were passing us by, but it doesn't necessarily follow that because things aren't going the direction we would want that the federal government should cast a bigger shadow. So someone could say, listen, we want greater standards or tougher standards, but when the federal government got involved in Common Core, it set off a war in a bunch of states. When the federal government pushed so hard on tests, we had this massive opt-out thing happening in a lot of states where parents didn't want their kids taking tests. We have all this money spent on tests and now states aren't using them. So it's one thing to push, but sometimes it's prudent not to push.
Yeah, no, I think that's... I think you're right. I mean, I think that if you or I had the perfect answer of what the federal role in education is, right, we'd bottle it, we'd sell it, and everyone would be like, yeah, hey, let's buy it, right?
Yeah, so in hindsight, so like, if you're a federal policy maker right now, based on these lessons you learned, what is like the right answer? Where should they push and where shouldn't they push?
Well, so I think defining the word push, right? So let's look at educator evaluation. That's probably as contentious as a initiative from the federal, state, and local level on down. Something that you and I worked on a little bit together.
We did.
And I had the privilege of leading the next phases of. So
why don't you talk about that? So back up and explain what it is that the federal government was asking states to do, and what did New Jersey do?
Sure. So there was, again, some philosophical agreement between Governor Christie and the Obama administration on a number of issues. So we in New Jersey, and this has even started when you were there before I got in there had been a push, there had been a task force say, let's look at educator evaluation and tenure reform and what some recommendations would look like. And let's initiate a pilot to understand what this might look like in practice with a handful of districts, and let's sort of start greasing the skids for some potentially significant changes.
Okay, but why? So why did the Obama administration, why did Governor Christie, why did other states think that educator evaluations needed to be reformed?
So I would say is that certainly I would say twofold. I mean, I think, nationally the widget effect, which was a publication that came out from TNTP, said, you know what, as we look at educator evaluation across the country, we're seeing that 99.5% or some number, some astronomically in a binary system, are all being rated excellent or satisfactory, and there isn't differentiation, teachers aren't getting appropriate feedback to enhance their practice, and that educator evaluation has become something that is, more of a compliance exercise, one that rather than supports teachers and where needed actually can exit in low performance.
And since we know because of data that teachers are the most important school level factor, the thinking was, okay, since teacher evaluation isn't currently working, we need a national effort to overhaul it to make sure that all kids have access to a great teacher.
Well, this is where, so when you say national effort, so this is where I think you're making a good point. Looking at New Jersey, and then we look at our data in New Jersey and say, you know what? That data, in terms of the widget effect, in terms of what we were seeing, and our system and the way that educator evaluation looked in regulatory, sort of the regulatory environment, the way that the tenure law was written, so you know what, these are unwieldy tools, right? These are not tools that help educators learn from one another, that helps a principal go into a classroom and give constructive feedback, helps them differentiate their best teachers from their weakest teachers, and make informed human capital decisions. Mm-hmm. So I would say, and this is where I think it's interesting, so we recognize that in New Jersey. We want to move forward on it. Concurrently, the federal government is saying, you know what, we're seeing this across a multitude of states, right? And we want to push in this, right? This is where the word push is interesting, because I would say it wasn't required, right? So it wasn't something we said that you have to do. Now, certainly there was some level through the ESEA waiver, through Race to the Top, that said, you know what, these are the right set of incentives or right set of behaviors that would push one into thinking that. And I use the word push there, because I think it was a nudge, a push. I don't think it was a mandate. I know you didn't say that. Was it too hard a push? Maybe. And I think that's where you're going. And also, as we think about the sequencing of this work, as you think about the idea of educator evaluation, especially in the use of test scores as part of the evaluation, was it prudent to put that piece of the sort of policy puzzle in place before you had time to fully adopt the standards, before you had time to fully adopt the new assessments? And I think in a theoretical sort of utopia, right, you could sequence these in a way and there'd be, but I do think that, the reality of working in these state agencies or even federal agency is that, you're up against a lot of challenges to navigate. You don't, time is a challenge. You have, changing doors of politicians. You have people who are vehemently against no matter what you do. And, you don't always have the luxury of sequencing things in a way that is perfect. So I would say, in hindsight, was that the right move at the right time by the federal government? Maybe not. Maybe it wasn't. Was it right for New Jersey? Yes, because we were moving in that direction anyway.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So the federal government did, let's call it incentivize states to go down this path with Race to the Top and the ESEA waivers. But what New Jersey did was decided, and correct me when I get some of this wrong, we're going to pass a law to reform teacher evaluation. We're going to try to change some of these tenure policies. So this passed bipartisan in the New Jersey legislature, and then it was up to you and your colleagues at the New Jersey Department of Education to actually make it work out. Now, in other states, the biggest criticism is states pass laws, they did all this work, but after years worth of teacher evaluation reform, it never solved the problem. That in a lot of these places, despite all the money, despite all the years, the same number of teachers are being rated as effective as not. Is the New Jersey experience different?
So first is, I would say, is the answer is yes, but yes. The answer is yes, it's different in New Jersey, but let me make 2 points. First is educator evaluation in a vacuum is never a lever that's going to drive student improvement, right?
Well, why not?
Well, as we think about this idea of, you know what, we're going to go in there and we're going to evaluate teachers, we're going to give them better feedback. Well, if your standards aren't high, if you don't have an assessment that's actually measuring what college and career readiness looks like, if you don't have actually ways to follow up and say, here's how you can improve, if you don't have a pipeline of new teachers ready to go, so the confluence of policies have to work together.
Okay.
And I think that, certainly, and this is, I think, there's blame to go around here is it was framed a little bit as a cure-all, that we're going to go in and we're going to, change tenure. We might even play around with last in, first out, the LIFO seniority rules. We're going to modify educator evaluation, and we are going to see sort of this, this efficacy curve of instruction, move in and of itself. I think that's misguided, right? And secondarily is the measure of whether it's working or not is not simply in the distribution of highly effective teachers down to the ones that are ineffective, right? And how many are getting fired. So certainly as we look at this, do we still have some level in New Jersey of some, a little bit of Lake Wobegon moving forward towards everyone being average or better? Absolutely. And do I think it's purely indicative of where actual ratings are? No, but I think it's going to take some time. Conversely, is it better than what we had before? Are teachers saying they're having better dialogue about instruction? Is there a common lexicon about instruction? The answer is we're hearing yes. Then you add on top of that, now you're getting data about your assessment. So as we're thinking about it, how are you infusing that in your lesson? So all of these pieces starting to work together, and certainly moving away from this idea that educator evaluation is a cleaver, and I'm going to come in and we're just going to chop off the bottom 5 or 10% of staff every year like Toyota or something. That's just not going to happen. And most industries, and having come from the private sector, they're not firing people left and right. The vast majority of New Jersey teachers wake up every day, come in there, give their best effort, which is quite good, and can they improve? Sure, we're all lifelong learners, and hopefully educator evaluation has helped that.
Okay, so let's start to pivot now towards the results. So just to start to put some of these pieces together, I think you would make the case New Jersey decided going on a decade ago, we're going to have higher standards, we're going to have tougher tests, we're going to have meaningful accountability, we're going to reform teacher evaluation, and if we stick with this stuff, we're going to have a higher quality teaching force, so we'll have more information, our schools will be more accountable, there will be more transparency, and we'll set high standards. So that's the theory of action. How's it actually worked out? Are kids better off in New Jersey?
So I believe so, right? And I'm someone who's going to call balls and strikes. So first is we're only in the early innings of this, right? We've only had 3 years of an assessment. We've only had a couple years of the new 4 or 5 years of the new standards. As we think about this, and this speaks to the revolving door we talked about earlier, is I believe the idea of fidelity of implementation, fidelity of staying the path and learning, we need to continue to study this. So as we think about the confluence of our policies, and I say that there's no doubt the data shows that our kids are learning. I believe and looking at data from SPAC and PARC, I think the improvement over the last 3 years in New Jersey, I think is tops in the country, perhaps. So as we think, and across every subgroup, across every race, ethnicity, grade level, what have you.
It's a good news story.
Yeah, it's a great story. It's a great story. We're extremely excited. And certainly, test scores are, I like to say, essential, not exhaustive.
Yep.
And math and ELA are not the whole child. No one would ever say that they are. But it's a nice lagging indicator after 6, 7 years of work to say this is some improvement you're seeing. a lot more analysis needs to be done. I think that in education, because of that revolving door partly, there's not real R&D, research and development. Are we studying this? I can't tell you that I have a multivariate regression analysis that says, you know what, of all the policies we did, this one in and of itself was the driver, right? And I'm not sure that's actually the right study. Because what we've been doing, I think, conversely, is you go down to the district level, you go down to the classroom level, having qualitative conversations like we have been and saying, why are you seeing the gains that you're seeing? What are you doing that is actually seeing that student performance in Algebra 1, leap so far, or third grade reading? And where districts are able to actually, and they are, articulate what they're doing, it gives you a real sense of how those policies have played out in practice. And I think that in New Jersey, we've moved past the fighting period. We've had this opt-out movement, and we had people beating the drum against the standards. Now it's this idea of, one of our colleagues, Carl Blanchard, has this idea of saying, you think about, initiative, and originally people were a little bit kicking and screaming. Then they move to a sort of a compliance stage. Then as they're saying, you know what, I'm going to do 3 observations, maybe quality, move to the quality stage. Then you move to where we are now, it's called ownership. And when I walk into a district, they're saying, this is our park data. This is our evaluation system. This is how we've tweaked it, how we're using it locally. And it's got to look different in Haddonfield than it does in Trenton. And here's why. And I get that. And I think that's the right approach. We, as the federal level and then even the state level, we're not teaching kids. Our goal, certainly, accountability and transparency has got to be part of it. But we got to set the conditions for success. And I think that's what the policies have done.
So one of the big reasons I wanted to have this conversation with you, not only because I think you've done extraordinary work and that New Jersey has a lot to teach the rest of the nation, but we are at this point where a lot of states could do the opposite, essentially, of what you're arguing for right now. So you worked at the State Department for quite some time. The state kept up on the same reforms, call it 6, 7, 8 years. But now Governor Christie is leaving office, and there are other governors who are leaving office. We also have a new federal law, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which gives all states the ability to radically change directions in a lot of different domains if they want to. So given that there is an opportunity for states to no longer stick with the game plan, to change directions, what would you tell states about that?
I'm certainly not in a position to tell 49 other states what to do, right? As much as I might like to sometimes, but certainly not in a position.
Okay.
First is know your role, right? I think that you've even written the policy paper with our friend Julie Squire at the helm, not the oar, which I think gives a good depiction of what is the state's role, right? And something we wrestle with all the time. And I want to be clear, that role is going to look different. So, having worked in Florida, when you have county-wide districts that are some of these huge districts and they have their own infrastructure and analytic engines within them, the state's going to play a different role. In a state like New Jersey, with about 600 small, fragmented, segregated districts, we can play a different role. So as we think about know the role in the context of your state. Number 2 is equity. And when I say equity, it means high expectations for all kids. I'm going to say it again, high expectations for all kids. This idea that college is only for certain kids and other kids can go to middle skill jobs or other kids can go to CTE, it's unbelievable how pervasive that still is. And, it is something that the state has the unique ability to say that's not going to happen. This is the bar, and we're going to hold a high level bar for all kids. And then number 3 is transparency and accountability. So as we think about that, and when I talk about high bar, it means high standards, high expectations, good assessments, but then transparency and accountability. For the most part, without the enterprise view that in this case New Jersey has, we would not know about the differences in our kids. We would not know about the education they're receiving. They certainly don't know because we have very insular districts in New Jersey. I mean, the story of New Jersey and home rule is every small district has their own school district, police, fire, library, and they don't know a lot of what their neighbor is doing. So, we like to say in an ideal world, we could be that Match.com and having, best practices, but certainly we need to understand what's going on because they don't necessarily understand what's going on, and parents don't know what's available in the neighborhood next to them. So those are 3 roles where I think the state, really needs to maintain a presence.
Okay, last question. There is one narrative that is developing as the history books are going to be written on this era. Some people are even calling it the Bush-Obama era from 2001 until the end of President Obama's term. So 16 years, the narrative is being written that the federal government was too intrusive, did too much, actually got in the way of state-level reforms just through so many strict rules and regulations that it inhibited creativity and the real advancements that states and districts and schools would have made otherwise. how would you write a different narrative if you don't think that one is right? What did it look like at the state level?
Yeah. First, my narrative would be different, right? And my narrative would first start with there's no one-size-fits-all narrative. And, yes, the federal government, bipartisan. You think about President Bush, Ted Kennedy. I mean, you think about it, this has been a bipartisan 16 years of sort of education reform at the state level. And I think that in and of itself speaks a lot, especially in the world we are now where you feel like there's such partisan politics on every issue. These were somewhat agreed upon. So as we think about this, and not by every flank of every aisle per se, but as we think about this, I think the role had been one of action. I think the way to define it is that we had a very proactive federal government. Very one that was driven to saying, you know what, we're going to push high expectations, we're going to push high levels of accountability, and we are going to be non-negotiable in how we do it, right? To the extent stagnate creativity, innovation, we don't know, right? We don't, there's no crystal ball of what the world would have looked like. I think it's a fair assertion, right? Left that as an assertion rather than a fact, and I think those two get mixed up in this day and age quite a lot. I would say that for states that have had success, and you think about states like Massachusetts and even Tennessee in recent years, it's about taking from the federal government what you need, and then certain things are required, but the way you shape them at your local level, you have a lot more discretion than folks realize. The federal government is not as heavy-handed as some folks might think it to be, and then staying the course. Again, I know I've reiterated that a couple of pieces. So, I would frame it as we've had a very active federal government, really centered for the most part around equity and accountability, equity, excellence, and accountability. And to the extent that they were heavy-handed in a couple of avenues, I think that's fair criticism.
That's great. Well, thank you for your service to education in general in New Jersey and other places. You've done a whole lot, and I know you're going to do a lot in the future. So thank you for that, and thanks for being my guest today.
Thanks so much, Andy. Great seeing you. Appreciate it.
Great seeing you too. Hey everyone, that's the end of our discussion with Pete Shulman. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, remember to like the video or leave us a comment. And be sure to check out the rest of our videos and research from AEI.